The Mojave Desert, a landscape of stark beauty and merciless secrets. For centuries, it has guarded forgotten trails, swallowed prospectors, and held the silent witness to events that defy human comprehension. But deep beneath its sun-baked crust, concealed by layers of geological strata and decades of deliberate obfuscation, lies a truth more chilling than any campfire tale. We speak of a place designated by the few who know its existence as Site Omega-7, a subterranean bunker network, sealed shut in 1955, its existence a phantom whisper in the archives of classified government operations. Its remnants are now little more than a sand-choked, rusted moor, a testament to a human collapse so profound, so absolute, that it was deemed too dangerous for the public mind. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This happened. Our journey into this darkness begins in the late 1880s, a time of grand industrial ambition and burgeoning occult fascinations. The American West was still being tamed, but for Satan minds, the greatest frontiers lay not in geography, but in the very fabric of existence. Enter the Blackwood family, a name now scrubbed from all accessible genealogies, but once synonymous with reclusive wealth and an esoteric intellectualism bordering on fanaticism. Led by Elias Blackwood, a man of formidable intellect and iron will, they established a sprawling estate nestled in a remote, almost inaccessible canyon in what would later become the Mojave. Elias, a self-taught chronosopher and amateur physicist, became consumed by a singular, terrifying hypothesis. That time was not a universal constant, but a localized phenomenon, a current that could be diverted, slowed, or even halted within specific, insulated parameters. His initial experiments were crude, involving hermetically sealed chambers and exotic mineral compounds, culminating in a series of disturbing observations he interpreted as proof. He believed he had witnessed brief, localized temporal distortions, moments where decay seemed to cease, where objects remained unnaturally pristine. These early successes, born more of confirmation bias and an escalating psychosis, solidified his conviction. Within a perfectly sealed environment, time itself could be stopped. The ultimate prize, immortality, or at least a cessation of aging. But there was a terrifying corollary to his theory. If time could be stopped within a defined boundary, then leaving that boundary would expose an individual to the accumulated temporal debt of the outside world. To step from their sanctuary, Elias preached, would be to instantly age, to collapse into dust, as the body rapidly processed decades, even centuries, of unlived time. This was the terrifying catalyst that would doom his bloodline. In 1890, spurred by a perceived cosmic alignment and a growing paranoia about the uncontrolled temporal flux of the external world, Elias initiated the construction of the bunker. It was a marvel of its time, funded by the family's vast fortune. Multiple levels burrowed deep into the earth, reinforced concrete, independent air and water filtration systems, extensive storage for preserved foods, and even a rudimentary hydroponic garden. He brought his wife, Eleanor, their 3 adult children, Thomas, Sarah, and Margaret, along with their respective spouses and several young grandchildren, a total of 14 souls, into the subterranean fortress. The sealing was a solemn, almost religious ceremony. The final steel door, weighing tons, slid shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the new, confined world, severing them from the sun, the stars, and the relentless march of time, as they understood it. The early years of isolation, from 1890 to roughly 1910, were marked by a fervent, almost cult-like adherence to Elias's doctrine. The bunker, a labyrinth of concrete corridors and steel doors, became their universe. Daily life revolved around meticulous resource management, the tending of the hydroponic gardens, and elaborate temporal stabilization rituals. These rituals, devised by Elias, were a grotesque parody of scientific method blended with superstitious fervor. They involved periods of absolute darkness, forced consumption of specific, often bitter, mineral-rich pastes, and repetitive, almost hypnotic chants intoned in hushed voices, meant to synchronize the internal temporal field. The children, born into this sealed world, knew no other reality. The outside was a myth, a place of instant decay and death. The Blackwoods were, by 1900, already a closed lineage. Elias, obsessed with the purity of their timeless blood, forbade any thought of reproduction outside the immediate family. Cousins married cousins, siblings married second cousins. The genetic bottleneck was immediate and catastrophic, though its full horror would only unfurl over generations. The first subtle signs of the descent emerged within the decade. Miscarriages became alarmingly frequent, often attributed by Elias to temporal impurities in the mother, or a weakness of will that allowed the outside's temporal current to seep in. Stillbirths followed, sometimes with infants presenting minor, yet disturbing, anomalies, a cleft palate, an extra digit, one unusually shaped skull. Consider the entry from Elias Blackwood's personal journal, dated October 12, 1905. The infant of Thomas and Isabella, a boy, was born with 6 digits on his left hand. A minor imperfection, yes, but a manifestation of the residual temporal instability in their lineage. It is a sign. The blood must be purged, purified. Only the truly attuned will carry forward the gift of timelessness. We must intensify the rituals. No weakness can be tolerated. Such pronouncements, rather than prompting concern, reinforced the family's delusion. Any deviation from the norm was reinterpreted as a unique marker of their timeless state, or a sign of an impurity that needed to be bred out. The children, already facing a life devoid of natural light and sensory diversity, were the first and most tragic victims. They were born into a world of scarcity, fear, and predetermined genetic doom. By the 1920s, the second generation born entirely within the bunker was reaching adulthood. Elias and Eleanor, along with the first generation, had begun to show undeniable signs of aging, wrinkles, gray hair, failing eyesight. This caused a profound crisis of faith. Elias, ever the manipulator, explained it away as a consequence of their initial exposure to the outside world before the sealing. Their bodies, he declared, were slowly shedding the temporal burden, while the new generation, born entirely within the sealed environment, would be truly timeless. This explanation, however flimsy, was accepted by a population with no external frame of reference. The genetic degradation accelerated. The subtle anomalies of the previous decade became more pronounced. Skeletal deformities were increasingly common. Children born with significant scoliosis, bowed limbs, and fragile bones that fractured with alarming ease. Many suffered from chronic respiratory issues, a consequence of the stale, recirculated air and weakened immune systems. Visual impairments were nearly universal, manifesting as severe myopia, nystagmus, involuntary eye movement, and eventually, complete blindness. The bunker's dimly lit corridors, once a sanctuary, now simply compounded their visual handicaps. A fragment from a journal belonging to Margaret, Elias's youngest daughter, dated June 17, 1928, illustrates the growing despair masked by fanaticism. Another stillbirth. Claire's fourth. The child was not right. Its head was too large, its eyes too wide and unseeing. Father says it is a cleansing, a purification of the ancestral impurities. I weep for Clara, but I pray for the bloodline. May the next be strong. May the next be whole. May be truly timeless. The pressure to reproduce intensified, driven by the dwindling population and the patriarchal decree to preserve the pure blood. Marriages were arranged between individuals who were often first cousins, sometimes closer. The small genetic pool became a stagnant, toxic pond. The children, already exhibiting developmental delays, were encouraged to begin procreation as soon as they reached physical maturity, often as young as 14 or 15, further compressing the generational timeline and amplifying the genetic defects. The bunker itself began to reflect their decline. Maintenance became sporadic. Corroded pipes dripped perpetually, forming mold colonies that flourished in the humid, stagnant air. The once bright hydroponic lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on their failing eyes. The air filtration system, once state-of-the-art, groaned and wheezed, struggling to keep the atmosphere breathable. A pervasive, cloying odor of damp earth, stale air, and unwashed bodies settled into every crevice. By the 1940s, the horror was undeniable, even to their deluded minds. The population had stabilized at around 20 to 25 individuals, but each new birth brought a fresh wave of genetic catastrophe. The physical abnormalities were no longer subtle. They were grotesque, almost monstrous. We are talking about severe craniofacial dysmorphism, sunken eyes, often milky or completely opaque, receding chins that gave their faces a bird-like appearance, pronounced frontal bossing, suggesting hydrocephalus, and narrow, constricted palates that made speech a painful, guttural effort. Their bodies were frail, almost ethereal. Generalized muscular atrophy meant they moved with a shuffling gait, their limbs often bowed or twisted. Osteomalacia, or softening of the bones, led to recurrent pathological fractures, leaving many permanently crippled. Their skin was translucent, almost gelatinous, revealing a network of blue veins beneath, and covered in mottled patches of unusual pigmentation. Their hair was sparse, brittle, often falling out in clumps. Intellectual and cognitive decline was equally devastating. Complex thought and abstract reasoning had vanished. Their language had devolved into a pidgin of broken English, punctuated by grunts and cries. Many suffered from severe autism spectrum disorders, rocking compulsively, fixated on repetitive tasks. They lived in a state of perpetual fear and confusion, their minds trapped within bodies that were betraying them from birth. The children, those tiny, suffering beings, were the ultimate testament to the ancestral sin. Their eyes, wide and vacant, stared out from malformed skulls, silently asking a question no one could answer. Social structures had collapsed entirely. There was no leadership, no formalized rituals beyond the instinctual drive to survive. The care of the most infirm, a constant burden, was carried out with a grim, almost ritualistic apathy. There was no joy, no curiosity, only the barest flicker of humanity amidst the overwhelming tide of biological decay. The fear of the outside, the core delusion, was deeply ingrained. It was not merely a belief, it was a terrifying, tangible threat. There are anecdotal accounts, passed down through the fragmented whispers of the survivors, of desperate attempts to breach the seal. One such incident, perhaps around 1948, involved a young man named Caleb, driven by a primal urge for light and space. He managed to manipulate the ancient controls of the primary airlock, a feat requiring a desperate, almost animalistic cunning. The eyewitness accounts, pieced together from later interrogations and found documents, speak of a collective panic. Caleb, gaunt and twisted, his eyes almost blind in the dim bunker light, stumbled into the airlock chamber. As the inner door sealed behind him, and the outer door began its slow, grinding descent, a cacophony of screams erupted from the watching family. They pressed their faces against the reinforced viewport, eyes wide with terror. What they saw solidified their nightmare. As the outer door opened to the unseen desert air, Caleb, for a fleeting moment, stood bathed in a strange, unfiltered light. Then, as if struck by an invisible hammer, his body began to convulse. His skin, already thin and pallid, seemed to shrivel, retracting from his bones. His sparse hair turned to dust, flaking away from his scalp. His eyes, already clouded, became milky white, then sank deep into their sockets. His frail frame buckled, his bones audibly cracking, his muscles atrophying at an accelerated, impossible rate. He collapsed, a heap of desiccated flesh and brittle bone, an instant mummy. The airlock door closed, trapping his silent, withered form within. The family, traumatized, retreated into deeper levels of the bunker. The airlock became a sacred, terrifying boundary, a monument to the relentless power of the outside time. It was a lesson learned in the most horrific way imaginable. To leave meant instant, agonizing annihilation. By 1955, the Blackwood bloodline was a mere shadow of its former self. The last coherent journal entry, found scrawled in a shaky hand on a mildewed page, dated March 1955, reads, "The light, it hurts. Always hurts. The air is thick, always thick with dust. The children cry, always crying. Their eyes, they see so little. But they are pure. They are pure. Father said so. We are timeless. We are timeless. The walls, they protect us. The walls, they watch." The handwriting deteriorates into a series of frantic, meaningless loops, then stops. The discovery came in the summer of 1955. A geological survey team, contracted by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as part of a Cold War initiative to map potential fallout shelters in remote areas, stumbled upon an anomaly. Subsurface radar indicated a massive, artificial structure deep beneath a seemingly undisturbed mesa. Initial probes revealed a vast network of sealed chambers. This was no abandoned mine. A specialized military unit, followed by a hastily assembled team of CDC, epidemiologists and government scientists, was dispatched. The process of breaching the main entrance took weeks, requiring precision demolition and specialized drilling equipment. The air, when the first breaches were made, was described by initial responders as a physical presence, a suffocating cocktail of stale oxygen, human waste, decay, and an indescribable, cloying sweetness. What they found inside defied every expectation. The initial exploration team, moving cautiously through the dim, mold-encrusted corridors, illuminated only by the harsh beams of their flashlights, encountered the living first. They were a small group, perhaps a dozen individuals, huddled in what appeared to be a central communal chamber. They barely registered as human. Their bodies were grotesquely malformed, mirroring the extreme deformities we've detailed. Skin like parchment, stretched taut over bulging craniums or sunken faces. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, hands and feet often club-like, with fused or extra digits. Their eyes, when they met the flashlights, were either opaque white or rolled back in their sockets, showing only the whites. They communicated in low, guttural moans and fragmented cries, recoiling from the light and sound with a primal fear. They were terrified, starved, and utterly broken. The stench in the bunker was overwhelming. A mixture of decay, waste, stale bodily fluids, and a strange, sweet odor that was later identified as the smell of severe, chronic malnutrition and metabolic distress. Every surface was coated in a thick layer of dust, mold, and human detritus. Primitive tools fashioned from rusted metal and scavenged materials lay scattered everywhere. In one chamber, a makeshift altar, constructed from bone fragments and corroded wiring, suggested a twisted form of worship. But the living were only part of the horror. Throughout the complex, the dead lay where they had fallen, a macabre timeline of the bloodline's collapse. Mummified remains of infants, still clutched in the skeletal arms of their mothers. Teenagers and young adults, their bodies twisted by scoliosis, lying in heaps in sleeping quarters. The airlock chamber contained the desiccated remains of Caleb, a silent, mummified testament to the family's core delusion. The entire lineage, from the relatively intact bodies of Elias and Eleanor, identifiable by personal effects and their age upon sealing, to the final, severely deformed generation, was laid bare. It was a multi-generational charnel house, a living archive of human suffering. Medical teams, horrified, quickly realized these were not patients in the conventional sense. They were biological specimens, living case studies of extreme inbreeding and prolonged isolation. Their physiological abnormalities were profound, their psychological state beyond repair. The discovery sent shockwave through the highest levels of government and scientific institutions. The implications were staggering, a self-imposed, multi-generational tragedy born of delusion, resulting in a biological catastrophe. Public knowledge, it was swiftly determined, would be catastrophic. Panic, ethical outrage, and a complete breakdown of trust in scientific authority were deemed inevitable. The order came swiftly and decisively, a complete and total cover-up. Project Chimera, as it was internally designated, became one of the most tightly classified operations of the era. All records pertaining to the Blackwood family were systematically purged from public archives. Their names, their wealth, their very existence, were erased. The survey team members, the military personnel, the scientists, and the medical staff involved were all sworn to absolute secrecy, often under threat of severe repercussions. Files were fragmented, dispersed across various intelligence agencies and medical research facilities, with no single entity holding the complete, horrifying truth. The survivors, the dozen or so individuals found alive, were immediately transported to a highly secure, undisclosed medical facility. They were designated subjects alpha, beta, and so on. They were not given names, nor were they treated as patients in the traditional sense. They were specimens. Intensive study commenced, focusing on their unique genetic mutations, their physiological adaptations to extreme deprivation, and their profound psychological damage. They were never integrated into society, never allowed to see the sun again. Their lives, if they could be called such, were a continuation of their ancestral suffering, albeit in a cleaner, more controlled environment. The children, those innocent victims, lived out their truncated, agonizing lives as captive subjects, their cries echoing in sterile, padded rooms. Site Omega-7 itself was scrubbed clean. Every piece of evidence, every artifact, every bone fragment was removed. The bunker network was then systematically demolished. Its concrete walls collapsed, its shafts filled with tons of rock and earth. Finally, the surface was meticulously re-landscaped, returning it to its original, undisturbed desert appearance. By late 1955, there was no physical trace of the Blackwood bunker, only the vast, silent expanse of the Mojave. The fate of the subjects Alpha and their descendants remained shrouded in the deepest secrecy. Government documents remained sealed, their contents locked away behind multiple layers of classification. It is widely believed that the individuals themselves did not survive long, their frail bodies unable to withstand the trauma and the sudden change in environment, even under the most advanced medical care. However, whispers persist within the darkest corners of the archive of collapse. Rumors of specialized genetic material preserved, of tissue samples kept in cryo storage, of a clandestine research program that continued for decades. Was the bloodline truly extinguished? Or does its genetic legacy, a testament to delusion and suffering, persist in some hidden ward, some forgotten laboratory, an enduring biological echo of a tragedy that spanned over 65 years of isolation, yet felt like centuries? The desert keeps its secrets, and the children, those spectral victims of ancestral decisions, still cry out in the silent, unwritten pages of history. We present this not as a warning, but as a chilling record of what happens when the human mind, in its darkest corners, embraces a truth that is a lie and sacrifices everything, including its very humanity, on the altar of a terrible, self-made God. Subscribe to Mr. Eerie Whisper, where every news story leaves a shadow behind. But remember, once you enter, the whispers never leave.